Thanks for showing up. I'm not Chris Valasak, as you might have noticed. Chris couldn't make it, so we're here. I am Luis. This is Ryan. And we're here to tell you a little bit of the stories what we've seen about ATM compromises, why you should try to be more cautious and careful when you use ATMs sometimes. And we're going to cover some of the stuff here. I think the most interesting part, we're going to cover like 3 case studies that we've done, and actually one of the assessments that we did, and what we find. Because one of the things, and like spoiling a little bit what we're going to talk in a few slides, is that when you think about ATM compromise, the very first thing that comes to mind is like physical, right? Somebody put a schemer that is going to copy your card and things like that. Well, we're going to not cover only that. The physical part is important, but there are other pieces there that are as important as that. And after we tell you about a whole bunch of problems, we're going to give you some suggestions about security recommendations in general and open up to questions. You want to introduce yourself better?
I'm Ryan Linn. I'm a senior security consultant at Trustwave as part of the network pen test practice.
Okay. And I run Spider Labs for Latin America. So I do this presentation all the time, talk to financial institutions and people interested in this kind of stuff. I think, and Ryan, he's actually done some of these consulting gigs. So he's smart, I'm not. But another point here, I think, is to remember, we're going to talk about ATMs, but there are several devices out there. They are not really ATM machines, but they kind of have the same issues around it. So we're going to talk about that. Real quick, who is Spider Labs? If you don't know, we're a part of Trustwave. We do a lot of consulting gigs. We do security research, application security, incident response. Actually, that's here. And we do a lot of speaking engagements. So if you stay in this room, actually, Jonathan Claudius is going to be doing some cool presentations. And I think you're doing a presentation tomorrow as well?
Yep, tomorrow evening.
Okay. So these were the mandatory slides. And there we go. So when we talk about, one of the things that we do, as I said, is incident response. And one of the things that we do a lot of work in the financial industry. And one of the things that we see, obviously, it's point of sale compromises. But if you see it there's a little 2%, a small portion for the ATM machines. Is that important because it's just 2%? Absolutely, because when there's a problem with an ATM machine or with a network of ATM machines, the fraud is much higher, right? So yes, credit card numbers, important, very important. But again, if you get ATMs spilling out money on the streets, that's a problem. We've seen talks in the past few years about this. And this is not one of those talks. We're going to cover a little bit more, maybe not too exciting, so exciting as much as the other work that has been done before. But again, they are an enticing target. Obviously, the newer ATM machines, they have a lot of security around them. But what happens to the older ones, right? Like the ones that look like this? Well, they don't get disposed, let's put it that way. It's easier to move them somewhere else. So as I said, I run Spider Labs for Latin America. One of the things that we see is that the newer machines go, and even in the US, we see that as well. The newer machines go to the flashy places, the shopping malls, whatever, or not always, but what happens to the older machines? They go to gas stations in the middle of the boondocks, right? They go in the middle of nowhere sometimes, and you see a machine that is sitting outside, has zero not physical security, but surveillance or a camera watching it. So these are the guys who some of the bad guys go after that. So the ATM focus attacks, as I mentioned in the beginning, we're going to talk about like 3 case studies that we've seen. Two are malware related to ATMs. Another one is everything that you can imagine related to security and technology. And again, one of the things that we always see is the traditional hardware tampering. When you talk about ATM security, that's the very first thing. And we do those kind of testings, and we're going to see some cool stuff. Malware-based attacks, we see like the regular, the ATM malware, but the local malware. And we also see the ones that sometimes they infect the ATM machines throughout the network, and the different types. And the network-based attacks. This is where Ryan shines here, and he's going to talk, and I'm going to shut up about that. So let's start with the cool stuff. So the number one here is malware that was packaged in the legitimate image for the ATMs. So we've seen that before, not just once. It's interesting that newer ATMs, they come out of the factory with a malware installed on it. Obviously, there is some insider information there and some insider job there. But again, it's a real problem. We've seen that. And this is sort of sophisticated. So the malware is installed, and the way it triggers the malware, different people within the bad guys organization, they have different cards, and every card triggers a different functionality of the malware. So the guy shows up with, I don't know, card number 1, and that card can only print, use the printer, the receipt printer, to print everyone who used that card, the card numbers and the PIN numbers, and is just going to print that. He collects that information, walks away. Somebody else, as we can see probably here, somebody else can actually dispense money from the ATM. Some other ones can actually uninstall this. So they leave this running for a while, they collect this, and they're harvesting information through this, and eventually they walk away. And before they walk away, and once they decide they're done with that ATM, they can't even uninstall the malware. So when people are going to do investigations on that, the malware is no longer there. So that's a little scary and makes the life very hard for everybody else, right? And of course, we always talk about logs as well. Well, you can also restore or delete logs from that machine.
One of the interesting things about this is who recognizes these dialog boxes? What operating system? Right, so a lot of these we see are Windows XP. So you start looking at older operating systems, the number of people who can write .NET apps versus can write binary code or assembly for specific platforms. And this really sort of opens it up for attack as well.
Cool. Any questions about this one? I'm going to move to the next one. How was the malware delivered in the first place? This one specifically was physically. So they opened the machine, was a Windows machine, as you can see. Not in theory. Many ATMs, they have the USB ports disabled. In this case, it was not. I think it falls into the problem that I was talking before, right? You move the older ATMs to certain like remote locations, and those they kind of like people forget about them.
What's the distribution of operating systems that are running on?
The question was, what's the distribution of operating systems? It actually varies, right? The older ones, they run, as Brian said, Windows XP. We see other flavors of Windows. The newer ones, they're more specific or more proprietary. But we can also see, Brian is going to talk about like some proprietary stuff, and we're going to talk about security by obscurity, and that has been surrounding ATM security for many years and should be forgotten. But yeah, we see all over across the board. Since the malware is written specifically for that platform, so the question was how the logs, how does it restore or deletes and manipulates the logs within the machine. It will since it's going to, if there are any logs, right? Logs could be from the malware itself or could be from the system, and it's going to just, it knows how the system works, so it's going to just delete them. Moving forward, case from my neck of the woods. This is, again, targeting legacy ATMs. This is another that was a standalone installer via USB. This is interesting because everything is done via the USB port on the device. The other is not as fancy as the other one. This one is very, let's say, simple. They open the machine, they put a special USB with an auto installer there, installs the malware in that machine, and a few days later, guy comes back with another USB key that only the malware is going to see the signature on that USB key, and it's going to dump all the information there. So there's no real interaction there with the user or with the bad guy, but he's going to take that out, and then they bring somewhere else, and they're going to read all the information there. We have seen cases that are not really related to ATMs, but just so you see how these kind of things work when we talk about like remote locations and things like that. I've heard of cases that the bad guys would drive in, get whatever device they had there doing the bad stuff, like, or that was compromised. They drive off and come back a few hours later, replacing that. And like the person who was working, it was a gas station kind of thing. They're like, what is this? Did you notice anything wrong? Yeah, this guy, he takes that box away and he comes back later. And like, you thought that was okay? He said, well, not really, but oh well, right? So yeah, it gets really bad. So this is, again, I think the operating system here, we know what it is. So he installs that, runs something, and then the malware keeps watching for something else, for a special USB key once it gets there. And this is, I think, this is going to get you thinking everything that surrounds an ATM, right? It's a network-based attack. This was the biggest problem there, lack of segmentation. So in theory, ATMs, they sit in like a segregated network. That's what everyone would think. Unfortunately, that's not the case all the time. So in this case, the public-facing website had a SQL injection. Don't have to get into details about that. From there, they started getting into the network. So they got the database server. From there, they mapped the network, which led to access all the WAN and branch offices, which they found out that the ATMs had VNC installed for admin purposes, and the VNC had blank passwords. And after that, they even found that the files were storing the data from the cards, right? The EPB, EMV, sorry, data. So this is, you can see, this is the other way around, right? Usually an ATM is sitting on a network, and that, in theory, that network just has ATMs and maybe like connections to the authorization switch, things like that. But in this case, it was everything. And we're going to get into a case that we actually have done a review here. So at this point, you might be asking yourself, right, how did the attackers get the malware there? We kind of talked a little bit. It's physical, but you're like, there's no security around it. Yes, there is, but we're going to see some of the bad cases, what people think security is. How can an attacker infect the whole network? And again, we would think that the PIN numbers would be encrypted, and sometimes they were. So I think this is what we're gonna, what we tested, right? So we left the cases that we studied, and we got hired to test a network. So we did this assessment, and we're gonna look for everything that I talked about for the most part. Physical security, and then network pen testing of the ATM network. You unplug the ATM, Brian plugs his machine, and he's going to tell you all about it, what he sees. Application security. When we say application, is not obviously it's not web application, but the ATM is like a package, right? As I said before, some ATMs they got out of the manufacturer with malware or out of the bank with malware, but application would be kind of the package from the operating system to does it have some sort of like file integrity software? Does it disables the USB ports? What kind of things can you do? We're going to talk about that. The other two, not really important for this matter. So I'm just cover this one, and then you can talk about everything else. So number one, what we do, we have to open the ATM. A guy who's a good friend of ours, from many people here, that actually works for us. He's really good with physical security. So the number one is to open an ATM. And opening an ATM, not for me, but for this guy is actually not a hard job. And as you can see, it's pretty much APC there. Has all the different connectors, USB ports, keyboard, all that kind of stuff. And to open this, it took him less than 8 seconds. So if he did that, an attacker could probably do that in less than 8 seconds as well. Actually, let me cover this one. And now, where the money is, right? The money box. So it has like a kind of two-factor security there. You need a key, and you need a code. So the key, we know how to deal with that, right? Same guy uses a lockpick, and he's going to open that thing, but well, he needs to know a code. For this one case, again, he was very lucky. But not only the code was easy, but the maintenance guys, they wrote it there, so it makes it easy for everyone else to remember. So, again, that is a no-no, right? Right there. So now I'll let Ryan talk about the cool stuff.
Cool. So one of the things I wanted to mention about one of the previous slides was you saw the methodology that for the network attack where people came in through SQL injection. How many people in here are pen testers? Okay, so a couple. This is basically the same methodology that we use on pen tests. We start off with SQL injection and then continually try to escalate on the network. So it's a matter of continually looking for the different pieces to escalate to the next step. So when we start talking about the network test, our goal for a network test is to get a foothold and then continue to escalate until we get to the thing we want to. So this would be pretty much considered the same thing that the attackers were doing would be a goal-oriented pen test. If I wanted to get to the target network, I would follow these same escalation steps. So we start looking at what we do on these ATM pen tests as well. We follow these same steps as the attackers do. So for the case study we're looking at, the way that they came in was so we had
jumped up this one.
So basically we start off someplace on the internal network. That's either unplugging the ATM and plugging ourselves in, which how many people have ever looked at the back of an ATM machine? Okay, so good, some nice mischievous people. Sometimes you'll see that the actual cord runs inside the machine, and sometimes you'll see that for easy access they cut out a place so that you can just jack them in the back. So it could be as easy as walking behind it and unplugging it from the wall or unplugging it from the machine and just plugging in there, or it could require you to actually go into a machine. So then for this case study, we went and did an initial scan of the network devices, and we found over 400. So normally you'd think that this stuff was segregated, but no, we saw everything on the internal network. And part of the reason that some people do this is if you have a number of internal people who have to access these, maybe segregation isn't important. But even when you're looking at doing things like escalating on the network, part of our goal in the pen test is to find the people who do have access, because in almost every organization, there are some people that will have access to this target environment. We haven't seen a whole lot of places where it's actually air-gapped. So it's a matter of working through the network until you find those people. So obviously this is an insecure remote access solution that was deployed on the ATMs. When the forensic investigators got the image of the hard drives and memory, they found that there were trace logs. So one of the things that you can do for debugging purposes, if you want to make sure everything's going well, is you can turn on trace logs. A lot of the times when we see these, they are storing sensitive information, sometimes track 1 and track 2 data, which makes it really easy for attackers. If you don't even have to do anything but pull these things off periodically via the network, there's not a lot of walking up to the machine and getting the information. You can do all this remotely. So you also see default vendor supply credentials for the operating system. And the PIN block was actually found to be single DS encrypted, so it was easy for the attackers to get back out. So for the case study, obviously we were able to get physical access in about 8 seconds, and then access to the cassette, which was the PIN pad and the additional lock, was gained in about 10 minutes. 500 plus network targets were mapped in 20 minutes, and the trace logs contained over 2,000 accounts. And all of this was done from a single ATM. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is this isn't necessarily unique just to ATMs. There are a lot of devices like this that have cash drawers that will dispense cash for specific things. Whether you start looking at places that do ticket redemption, or you start looking at places that, well, you can use your imagination for the different places where you can swipe your credit card and say, I want $10 back, and it will dispense you 10 bucks. So the same sort of stuff happens. And so when we start looking at doing these types of testing, one of the things that's most important is we take a holistic look. We want to look at the physical security. And it turns out that a lot of these devices physically, you're looking at have all the same locks when you buy them from the manufacturer. So one key will open all of the locks. And a lot of the times those locks are those 8-second locks. So one of the things if you're deploying these devices and your organization is responsible for them, make sure that you're assessing what type of locks you're putting in them. And step 1 is upgrade the locks. First of all, if somebody else owns one of these machines, you don't want them to be able to get into your machine, so you want to make sure that yours is keyed individually. But you also want to make sure that you have something that's going to take longer than 8 seconds. So that even if somebody does walk in with a uniform and say, I'm here servicing the machine, that if they have to fiddle with it for 20 minutes before they can get the top open, somebody still has a higher chance of going, that looks strange. And then also from there, start looking at securing the inside of the computer. I mean, that looks very similar to my computer from the mid-90s. So you can imagine that the physical security for the actual hardware itself may not be that great, but making sure that for the operating system you're turning off USB ports and that sort of stuff. Somebody walks in with a portable keyboard, takes 8 seconds to open it, and then has full operating system access. You have another problem. One of the other issues that we see with these is people logging in as administrator and all of the software running as administrator, which if you do have that portable keyboard, again, you're pretty well set if you just have to plug in and hit Control-Delete and run a command shell, because everything's running as local administrator. So making sure that you're running with limited accounts as well. And so from the network standpoint, we see a couple of other interesting things with these. So these are Windows XP machines a lot of the time. So we still see the same vulnerabilities we see for Windows XP for remote attacks. Stuff like MS-3026 or MS-808067, all of those sort of like easy mode, awesome exploits that just sort of work all the time, they tend to work for this type of environment. So there's a couple of pieces there that make securing the operating system and the network more important.
But even some of the malwares, they also like target these vulnerabilities. So we talked about the malwares that they're physically installed, like locally installed on each one of the machines, but you have malwares that propagate just like any other malware.
And so the network segregation part, obviously you want these to be part of their own network, but you also want to make sure that the network connections where they're being deployed is secured. And so that's another physical aspect. But what's interesting is sometimes you don't necessarily have control over that. So you want to make sure that you have other pieces of security in place, whether it be port security or finding a MAC address to the network port, something to make it a little bit more difficult, to make it more obvious that someone is doing something strange. Obviously, if you can put it in the back of your truck and walk away with it, it's sort of game over already. But especially when you start looking at some of the places that these types of devices are deployed where there may be less security, like nail salons, that sort of place where you may be less likely to find lots of cameras. You want to make sure that it takes you as long as possible to get into one of these so that somebody at least is curious about what you're up to.
But even like places that have security guards, it happens to one of the gigs that one of our consultants here from the U.S. did in Latin America. He was playing with the machine for a while, was in a shopping mall. The guard shows up and he's like, "What are you doing?" He's like, "No hablo español." And the guy's like, "Oh, okay." And just left the guy alone, and for another like 5 minutes, he was able to do stuff there. The question was, what's the maximum amount of money? Obviously, it depends on the brand and the model, but it's average like $10,000.
It also, I think, depends on where they're deployed.
Yeah.
So, you know, again, a nail salon may not have as much as
Las Vegas.
right. Someplace where they want you to be taking out hundreds.
Yeah.
Your slide mentions access to the cassette. Is that you mean the physical access or
Physical access.
with the operating system?
So there's actually two pieces to that. So where he showed the pin pad with the key together, that is where the cassettes live. There's like a little safe down at the bottom which has two-factor authentication. And the two-factor authentication looks a little bit different. So that is where the cassettes of money are stored. And so typically you have a security person walk up, put their key in, type in the number, and then open that, deal with the cassettes. But it turns out that obviously the software has to dispense that stuff.
Yeah.
So depending on how much time you have on one of these, looking at attacks for like many of these, as you can see, there's serial connections and that sort of stuff. You'll see either a serial connection or a USB connection going to the cache tray. So the question is, how long will it take you to figure out the protocols behind dealing with the cache tray?
There was a question here. Yeah, the question was, don't they have some sort of monitoring of these devices, like sitting there? And yes, they do, for most part. Obviously, the older ones, they don't have it, or sometimes they take the risk. But yes, we had a case that, yes, they said the guy was there and he was like playing with that, and the customer was sitting there. It's like, look, I opened that in like very easy. And it's like, yeah, but every time you do that in our knock, they have they get an alarm. This guy call your knock, see if they got an alarm. So he knew there was also like a physical kind of device there that kind of like, you see in the movies, right? You put the gum or you hold with your finger and it doesn't go off.
What kind of interface is present for commanding the cassette to reject one?
The question.
Is that authenticated in any way? Is it included in his input to just command that to have access to the hardware rather than picking the lock and using the combination? Suppose you don't know the combination like this.
The question was, how is the access to the lock through software? Is that what it is? If it's authenticated or not, how does that work? It's what Ryan was saying, right? Number one, it depends on the model. Sometimes it's very easy. Sometimes, like the newer models, they're more, again, proprietary. Sometimes we play with it and just change the logos and things like that on the application side. And then it's just a matter of time to find what's the... So is it authenticated? I don't remember seeing any that was actually authenticated.
And then the other piece of that is if you have enough time to actually start, pulling apart the applications, looking at DLL injection and stuff like that, even if it is authenticated, you may be able to directly call API functions, that sort of thing through DLL injection. So it depends on the level of access you have to the device.
One there, then Mike. John? Mike.
Similar question, but you're looking at the hardware interface between the controller and the cassette. Like, can you tap into those wires?
The question was, is it possible to, if you look at the hardware, if you can put some sort of tap between the cassette and everything else in the machine? Possibly. We haven't tried that.
So I think the other piece with the tap question is if you have access to look at the serial or USB commands, as not just a matter of finding out what they are, but they typically have to be sequenced in a certain way. So spending enough time to determine the sequencing of this sort of thing. So it's a little bit more complex than just like, you know, a command that says spit out 20s, because it's usually a series of sequences that you have to go to actually get any of that to work.
So I have some experience in this area in the past, like we said, two types of work. So one of the things I thought was really interesting when I was back in civil infrastructure was that a lot of these like business running like, you know, your standard operating systems like Windows XP, like you were saying Ryan before, like MS-DOS XP stuff is like an easy way to get in. One of the things that I saw was that at the time that I was doing it, there was sort of a migration going towards trying to tie into AD. So it sort of fought that kind of air gap concept that you were talking about. So this could be an awesome way to not just, you know, attack the ATM, but also to attack the rest of the infrastructure. One of the other interesting things on these devices, at least the ones that are XP when I run them, was that a lot of them had like an administrative console for a service technician. So it's just like something that you could look up online as simple as like 6 zeros, and then just dial it in and you can kind of move the cassette tapes around without having to do a lot of reversing.
So that's a good point. Both the fact that a lot of these are working on tying back into Active Directory, which hurts the network segregation, but also means that you're more likely to have people with administrative access accessing these, so that if you do get a compromise, you can escalate in the domain as a whole. Also the thing about having administrative pins for the machines themselves, the same way that the bad guys use cards to get specific access, a lot of these also have administrator key cards. So the question is, do you have access to administrative key cards? You know, you can do that, and as you mentioned, renumber cassette tapes or cassettes and that sort of stuff. So all of a sudden, you know, 20s or 100s, that sort of thing. And so as far as the network stuff goes, one of the other pieces that I wanted to mention was, so we've talked a lot about the Windows XP ones, but there's also proprietary operating systems out there. And so whether it be Windows XP or it be one of the more proprietary ones, part of the thing is security by obscurity will only last for so long. One of the things that I've noticed with a lot of these is the communication protocols they use may or may not be encrypted. And so even if they are encrypted, the encryption libraries may not be awesome. For instance, if it's using a poor implementation of certificate handling and you can cause the machine to accept a bad certificate, you can still view SSL encrypted traffic. So when you start looking at that and you start looking at these protocols, just because the protocol is proprietary doesn't mean it's hard to pull apart. One of the things that we do a lot is looking at traffic on the network and finding credit card numbers. And so we've gotten kind of good at looking at stuff, figuring out what formats a lot of people are using for credit card numbers. I've seen them everything from they've been super secured with base 64 encryption, which is obviously just encoding and really easy to undo. But also a lot of these protocols are fixed length fields. So writing parsers to take this data apart and then pull out just the good bits is not that difficult. And we're actually going to be talking a little bit about doing that in a presentation I'm doing tomorrow if you're interested in that sort of stuff. But so being able to take these things and look at this traffic that people are moving towards having more of it SSL encrypted, but there's still a lot of it that we see out there that still isn't. And even new rollouts we're seeing that people aren't doing encryption. And so if you have the ability just to sit between one of these devices and their upstream network, you can potentially even just passively listen and just quietly gather stuff along the way. So you wouldn't even ever have to access device or compromise a machine. So as far as the security by obscurity goes, you know, regardless of what somebody says that their communication is proprietary, whatever, make sure that you do have application pen test or network pen test come in and look at the communications between your pieces and see what's really there. So, do you want to do the recommendations?
Yeah, sure. So I think the important part here, and again, remember this doesn't really apply just to ATMs, right? He mentioned other types of systems. We see the growth of like different types of kiosks and things that do different things. Even like in airports, you see kiosks for auto check-in and things like that. So yes, credit card numbers are important, but it's the bad guys are after anything they can monetize, right? So I think keep in mind that you're not only using an ATM, it's not only physical security. Kind of know who's servicing your ATMs, kind of the story that I said, right? The guy is there, shows up, starts messing with it. What are you doing here? I don't know. No, make sure people if the ATM is in the premises that has security personnel, that they actually know who's servicing the ATMs, and know who's servicing the ATMs on the sense that they're not giving out the goodies, right? They're not spilling out the beans to how they do that, or if they're using the same key for everything, if all the ATMs, they share the same secret code, things like that for servicing. Make sure it uses PIN encryption correctly. Don't use like some protocol that is easily crackable. I think we covered most of it. The presence of like trace logs, again, have logs inside the system that are actually not that people are not able to manipulate them. I think that's the point. And ATMs are just like many other types of devices like that. They're just computers. So some, again, they're newer ones. You think they're, oh, this is a total new device, but no, with a little bit of effort, even if you cannot break that one machine on the network side, as Ryan was saying, right? Just watching traffic, you can probably get an idea how they're communicating and get some good information from there. Understand that ATMs, yeah, sure, don't use them.
One of the other things I wanted to add to this was management protocols for these devices are as important as the actual transactions. So a lot of the times when these are centrally managed, you may see the actual transactions themselves are encrypted, but the management protocols going to these devices may not be. If you have the ability to figure out how the management protocol works and then add your own pieces to the operating system, it certainly will hurt the overall security, especially if you can change boot up sequences, inject malware through the management protocols, that sort of stuff. So make sure that not just your sensitive, credit card data is encrypted, but also your management traffic as well.
I think we got a few minutes for other questions. I think there was a question there.
Yeah, I had a question about relating to the app. Could you ever set up a log and go through that log to see what sort of patterns showed up and use those patterns to figure out what was going on protocol?
You mean for the malware?
For the set or the encryption.
Oh, right. You were talking, it was a follow-up to his question. Okay, so the question was talking about the communication between the dispenser and everything else. If we were to set up a tab, if we could just like look at try to analyze the pattern of what was going on if there was or there is a sequence, right? Sometimes there's a sequence to kind of find that, yes. But we haven't done the tab thing.
How would you do something like that?
Mike?
8 seconds open.
Yeah. If you had, I think there are so many different models that I'm sure they have like, it's not one standard type of connection that is going to be from one type of ATM to another.
And the cache drawers are a little bit interchangeable, so a lot of the times you'll see configurations for individual cache drawers. So you would have to find something with the specific piece of hardware you were looking for, and then figure out how to talk to that specific thing. And then there's a question of, are you going to interact with it? Like, what is the device doing while you're interacting with it? So you would have to have a lot more control in order to make some of that work as well.
Or if you're able to buy an ATM like Barnaby Jack did a few years ago, right? Then you have all the time to open it up and find all the goodies in there.
and that's a good point. One example of where we were doing some testing and stuff did start showing up is we were looking at actually middling some of these devices, and we injected a bad certificate. And so before you could click anything else on the screen, there was a big, do you want to accept the certificate, yes or no? And so obviously if somebody walked up to that, well, there's two interesting pieces to that. Obviously, if we kept making that show up, eventually somebody would click yes. But the other piece of that is obviously if anybody's paying attention or this is in any sort of high visibility area, you're probably caught. You know, it's not just a matter of exploiting it and doing stuff, but if specific applications die frequently on these because you've been messing around with it, the device will quit working. You know, those sort of things which will get you either caught or will spoil your fun depending on how you look at it.
So the question is if the banks or ATM manufacturers are keeping up with patches and things like that. Yes and no, right? Sometimes the banks don't own the ATM. Sometimes they kind of lease the network from somebody else or the ATMs from somebody else. Or sometimes they push back on the manufacturers. So, and usually the response from manufacturers is obviously they're making their product better. And then you go back, so the newer products, obviously the security is better. Not they're flawless. Security, you cannot say anything's 100% secure. But on the flip side, that's what I was saying in the beginning, right? What happens to the older ATMs, right? That same older ATM that might be vulnerable to everything else is in the same network. Then you have to look on the network side and make sure it's not a flat network, not flat in the sense of being the same layer 2 domain, but they're like, it's segregated, right? It's not, you cannot see the the branch manager computer through the ATM network. That's bad.
I think people the big places are getting more aware of this sort of stuff. And I think that one of the things is increasing monitoring so that you do know when things are going on. You know, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier with, you know, it's going to be the one-offs that are going to be less likely to get caught when something's going on with. And that's, you know, the hardware attacks and the software attacks both, I think.
Yeah. Anything else? We're running out of time. So thank you very much. Oh yeah, we got a few resources.